Hi everyone, welcome. I'm preparing to head downstairs to my wormery to check in on a couple of my worm bins, and like we do sometimes, we've stopped here at my computer to check in on my tracking spreadsheet just so I can orient you to what my game plan is and show you what's on the books for today. What I've got planned for today is a haul out of my second oldest bin. It's the bin of my original red wigglers. As you can see, they're labeled with the little O in front of RW. And it just so happens that on this day, the system is 365 days old, 1 year old. And you know, I really do wish that the older bin, the 383-day-old bin, were also ready for a haul out of the worms. But there, the worms are just, for whatever reason, taking forever to move out of the finished castings. It's been over here 47 days now since we set up the first of 5 now horizontal migration feedings. And, you know, there were 10 days that passed, and 11 days that passed, 9 days that passed, 10 days that passed. It's now been 7 days since that last check-in when we applied feeding number 5. And at that time, I was finally starting to see some of the material in the younger of the two bins becoming a little bit more crumbly, a little bit more loose, a little bit more dry. And I think the key is the dryness that seems to motivate the worms to leave this stuff and make their way over to the feeding zone where I can round them up and haul them out. So my game plan was to really just sort of detach these two from being buddy bins, and now at this point move forward with the haul out of the original worms in the now 1 year old 365-day-old system. And what I've got built up down here are 2 new bins built to house whatever worms we managed to haul out of there today. And I did build those bins with a whole bunch of fresh cardboard and paper, shredded paper and cardboard mix and leaves. But I also included a good bit of this material that was sitting in this bin that was built 40 days ago. So they've got a whole bunch of nice aged material. I also pre-built these bins with a whole bunch of food too. So they've got a nice cozy environment to be moved into. So my plan right now is to head on downstairs, do the haul out of the younger bin, and launch off these 2 new systems. And maybe a couple other things. So I'm going to grab my camera, head on downstairs to the wormery. So let's regroup down there and we'll get started on this project. So here on the bench you can see the 2 new bins that were just built earlier. But they're going to be moved aside because the focus of today's work is going to be these little guys right here. The second oldest bin, the 1 year old bin now, of my so-called original red wiggler worms, getting their first haul out. Probably not the last because there's probably still worms in the castings material, so we'll be resetting the feeding zone to continue the migration. My hope is that we've got a good number of worms gathered so far so that we can get a nice decent number of worms gathered together with which to launch those 2 new systems. So let me get my glove on and we're going to get to work. So I've got my little plastic tray here into which we're going to drop the contents of the horizontal migration feeding zone. I just hope it's big enough. Sometimes I'll use a somewhat larger container. But I've got some food in there, the food that I used to build the 2 new bins. I'm even wondering if we might be better off using this somewhat larger container to put the worms into, because it is quite a bit deeper. And I think we could possibly use the space. So, you know what? Let's set this food aside. This is the food that I held on to and didn't include in the build of the 2 new bins because this is what I'm going to reset the feeding zone with. Because I seriously doubt that the migration is complete. I'm pretty sure we're going to have to continue to get the last of the worms out of here, but my hope is that we've succeeded in convincing a large number of the worms in the system at least to gather over here in the horizontal migration feeding zone. So stuff like this piece of these couple pieces of paper here, I think we're going to be able to just reuse as some of the bedding with which to rebuild the horizontal migration feeding zone. I've got my prepared bedding with which we can also do more of the same. I'm already starting to see some leftovers of what we put in here a week ago to try to motivate the worms to move out, to come on over, hang out in the horizontal migration feeding zone. And I guess that's not too surprising after only a week. So I guess before we rip into here, I'm just a little bit curious to see what we see. One thing that I did do, let's turn this light over here on too. One thing I did do between the last check-in a week ago and now, today, was I did come in here to till the system up and stir things around in both of these bins where the migration is going on. And it was at that time I really did notice that there was a significantly fewer number of worms occupying this material out here. As you can see out here on the very furthest edge, away from where the horizontal migration feeding zone is, the material is starting to get nice and crumbly. Vast improvement over how it had been when we first started the migrations. And I really do hope that the material gets similar to this in the other bin too. I mean, so far I don't think I've even seen a single worm yet, which is a terrific thing. So I mean, yeah, we saw a couple worms hanging out over on this side when we first arrived. Oh, I spoke too soon. There we go. One little wormy, which we're going to help get right over to where we'd like for them to be at this point. But this is definitely a good sign. I mean, I don't want to sort of count my chickens before they hatch. I don't want to assume that we've got ourselves a 100% completed depopulation of the finished castings. It seems very unlikely that that would be the case here. But it is very nice to be pouring through this material in this way right now and finding pretty much no worms. Very, very satisfying, if you will, after a month and a half of waiting for this to happen. And it's so nice to see how nicely this material crumbles too. It does actually break apart into very fine material. Only a couple chunks remain as whole, kind of clumpy pieces. But for the most part, it's all starting to become nice and granular and flowing. And that's really, I think, what you want, you know, because as long as the material is in that sort of condition, it's very easy to handle. It doesn't stay all clumped together and nasty. And I guess best of all, it does finally have that somewhat reduced moisture content, which has evidently motivated our worms to exit for the most part. So I guess as we start to work our way over to where there was still bubble wrap covering things here and helping to keep the moisture down, we're going to start running into worms. And I'm not really interested in trying to actually pick them all out and move them out, but if I encounter one here and there, I'll just go ahead and toss it over onto the side where we're going to be pulling out worms from. But this is really coming along good. This almost tells me that we can probably reset, let this thing go for just a little while longer, and then we could probably do a final haul out of worms from here. Because it does seem like we're almost at that point where this material has been almost completely depopulated. Very nice to see. Actually quite surprising if if I've got to be honest, because I really wasn't expecting to see such good results today. So good news. Very nice to see. So I think that's the worm right there that I was trying to capture before. So yeah, I mean, as we start to work our way over more and more to the side where the feedings have been getting applied and where the plastic coverings were helping to keep the moisture down within the bedding over on this side, we're going to obviously encounter more and more damp finished castings as we get closer, which means that that material is going to, you know, still be cool and damp and moist enough that the worms are still going to be quite comfortable hanging out in it. So we do still have some finished castings here that still need to be depopulated. So rather than me just picking through all this stuff and individually relocating worms out of it over into the collection area, why don't we just go ahead and proceed with the matter at hand, because we will be resetting and we will be resuming the migration and allowing it to continue to the point where it's actually 100% complete or very close to it, with a pretty much depopulated batch of worm castings here. But it seems to me like we're probably going to have ourselves a nice haul out. You might remember on the tracking spreadsheet, I didn't draw much attention to what the original estimated starting population of these two bins were, because whatever number that was all those days ago, and at this point over a year in the case of the older bin, and exactly 1 year ago, it was you know, under 1,000. Under 1,000 worms were estimated to be used to launch this system off originally. But I'd like to think that over that time the worms have found that the material that they were in was spacious enough and roomy enough for them to increase their population size and increase their numbers. So I don't know exactly how many worms we're really dealing with here at this point after a year of being in service. But what we're going to end up doing is try to take a look at what we're pulling out. And then even when we launch them off into their new homes in the 2 new bins, we're going to try to come up with some sort of a rough estimate. And this is where I like to turn to the viewers to get input from everyone to see what everyone thinks in terms of, you know, how many worms we used to launch off our new worm bins. And then whatever we come up with as far as an estimate goes, that's what I usually include in my tracking system. So the numbers are always averaged, so everybody's input is taken into account and averaged to give us an averaged estimated worm count. And like I usually do when I'm launching 2 new systems, I usually prefer not to treat one as having more worms than the other. It's going to be my preference to just, you know, and I'm going to be trying my best to evenly take the worms that we've collected and divvy them up evenly into the 2 new systems. And I'm almost wondering if we might, you know, I don't know if we would benefit from actually dividing them here now and grabbing half of them and putting them into one container, taking the rest of them, putting them into another container, and then treating that as the equal division of the worms. And then coming up with some sort of an estimate later as to how many worms we've got. So it seems like as good a approach as any. I don't know. I see no reason to think that they might be more worms on one side or the other. Why don't we do it that way? So we'll sort of create a nice little dividing line here down the middle. We'll start out by extracting the contents of the horizontal migration feeding zone, or at least half of it here, and plopping them into this container. And all the while I'm going to be doing my best to show what I'm seeing here and sharing it with you guys so that with your help we can maybe come up with an estimate for how many worms we're populating our new systems with. It certainly does seem to me like we've got a fairly large number of worms hanging out here in this material. It's also nice and loose and fluffy and got some nice moisture content. There's a good bit of leftover bedding in here. There's even some food scraps. So not only are they being moved into a nice fresh environment that's already got a whole bunch of food in it, all set to go, looks like we're also bringing over some leftovers from the most recent replenishment of the feeding zone over here in the migration area. So why don't we treat that as the worms that are going to be used to populate bin number 1. And then I'm just going to set that little bag aside with the foods in it so that we could use this round container to hang on to what we pull out over on this side. And here too I'm going to be just doing it in a slightly slower way than could be. So I could certainly just pull it all out 1, 2, 3 and be done with it, but I am deliberately going a little bit slower to permit everyone an opportunity to see how many worms we're dealing with here, so that hopefully at the end of the video everyone will have a sense of approximately how many worms we've just managed to haul out of here, and hopefully I'll be able to convince you all to give me some input on how many worms we're moving over into the new systems. Now I got to admit, I'm getting this gut feeling like we've just managed to pull out a somewhat larger quantity of worms into this container here. And since there's still some more worms to be hauled out, I'm thinking maybe we can level the playing field by putting the rest of what's in here into that square tub. Because it almost does feel to me like we've pulled out more worms at this point than what we pulled out into the other one. So maybe just one more small little handful, and then what remains will be placed into here. And all I could say is that that's just sort of a gut feeling in terms of how many worms I thought I saw when I was pulling them out. It does feel to me like, look at that, nice little worm ball hanging out over there. It does feel to me like by doing it this way, we've got a somewhat more even distribution of the worms, and hopefully a good amount of worms in each bin that we're launching today to get those systems off to a good start. And I do get that feeling like that's exactly what we've got here. So I think what remains here is just basically a reset of the horizontal migration feeding zone, a little bit of fresh bedding, some of that food that I've got over there in that bag, and just put it right back up on the shelf and let it continue. But there's not a whole lot to be seen with that, so I might actually do that off camera. It doesn't seem interesting enough to spend time in the video doing that here. I think what I'd really like to do is just get these little guys loose into their new homes and let those two new systems get off to their new start. So why don't I bring out those two new tubs? I'll set this one back up onto the shelf for now, and I'll tend to the reset after we're done here. But I think it's time to launch off the two new systems. So let's make that happen next. Okay, we've got the two new bins out here on the bench ready to go. And what I did was I actually took the time, a few minutes, to actually do the reset of the feeding zone, the horizontal migration feeding zone in the system that we just did the haul out from, as well as the older bin that we didn't even work on today, to just put a little bit more food in there to replenish the food in the horizontal migration feeding zone of that system too. So that leaves us really only with one more thing, which is to release our worms into their new homes. So as always, I'll be looking to hear everyone's input as far as how many worms we've released into these systems. My preference would be to have just one number that applies to each system, you know, so if that makes sense. So I'd like to think that I did do an even split of the worms, that I do have an equal number in both of these containers and an equal number of worms being released into each of these tubs. So what I'm really looking for is a guesstimate as far as what the worm population is of each of these bins, but I'd just like to have sort of an even number. So I mean, obviously if it does seem like we've got way more in one system or the other, then I might have to deviate from that game plan, but whatever, we'll only know once we release them and we see. So don't forget to leave your comments. I'll be looking forward to hearing everyone's input as far as how many worms we've released into each of these systems. But let's not wait any further. Let's let these little guys loose. Okay, I think we've released every worm from this container. Same thing here. I will take a closer look just to make sure we didn't leave anyone behind. And just to give each worm a good, fair chance at making its way down into the environment without being piled up on top of a bunch of other worms and stuff, I'm going to do what I'm doing here, which is just to sort of spread everything out and give everyone fair access to bedding below so they can all squirm out of view. So let's let them get situated and we'll be finished. Alright, well that was pretty quick. These worms are pretty fast movers. They did seem to dive down into their new home pretty readily. The only worm I found was one that was stuck to my glove, and I just tossed it into the container. And here the only stuff I'm seeing is a little bit of casting material and a couple chunks of bedding stuck to the containers, but no worms in either of these, which is kind of nice. So luckily we were able to do the haul out and the transport of the worms without losing anyone, or at least so it seems to me. We definitely gave it a best effort to make sure we didn't lose anyone. So that leaves us with only one final order of business. That's right, you guessed it. Time to christen the bins. So please join me in christening and welcoming my two newest worm bins. Two bins now, housing the so-called original worms to the wormery. And I guess if I didn't put the labels on properly, I can come back and fix them later. Alright everyone, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. Alright everyone, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.